Thank you for getting so quiet. Hi, I'm Ann Kennedy, and I'm a member of the board at TILS. Before I forget, I have to plug this, and with pleasure. This is the Barnesville Comedy Club's 100th year, and they're having a celebration on Saturday, August 20th from 5 to 10. There'll be music, food, drink, silent auction, and more. The Comedy Club, as you know, is right down the street. It's been our neighbor forever, and we intend to support that event and hope that you will also. So that's that. I also, last weekend, we were treated to very nice wine, and I neglected to thank and acknowledge Brian and Kathy Smith from Barnesville Market for that generous donation. So I want to do that now. And tonight I want to thank Lynn and Steve Hesslinger, who are here. Craig Shelter, who's here, and Terry Riley, not last but not least, Terry Riley and Mark Wertman. They are making tonight possible, and without our sponsors, we couldn't do what we do, so we really appreciate every sponsor we have. So tonight, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Peter McMahon, who is the founding director of Cape Cod Modern House Trust. The trust was incorporated in 2007 in order to archive, restore, and celebrate the Outer Cape's outstanding modern architecture and the creative culture that surrounded it. Mr. McMahon's own summer house has been published in House Beautiful and Outside Architecture. His own design business, PM Design, focuses on sustainable modern architecture and restoration of mid-20th century buildings. Beginning in the late 1930s, the Outer Cape attracted some of the prime movers of modern architecture, including Bauhaus luminaries and self-taught American design builders. This group created homes for themselves in the isolation of the Outer Cape, creating a vibrant and expressive community. Some of these homes were eventually abandoned and are now property of the National Seashore National Park Service. Tonight, our speaker will explore the fascinating history and the current efforts by the Cape Cod Modern House Trust to revive and reimagine this legacy. Mr. Peter McMahon. Thank you.
Great.
That's good?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thanks for having me for Tales of Cape Cod. And I...
You have to speak very loudly.
Okay. Can you hear me back there? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these houses ended up on the Cape and some of the people that made them and lived in them, and then something about our efforts to restore and repurpose them. So, as many of you probably know, I like to always start with the end of the last ice age. The last glacier that retreated, pushed all this sand in front of it and dumped all the topsoil around here and on the islands, and on the Outer Cape just got sand. So the Outer Cape has always been a hunter-gatherer kind of economy since agriculture wasn't possible. And the buildings we're talking about are going to be, you can see Wellfleet Harbor up there. So to the right of that on the Wellfleet-Truro line, and then to some degree on the bay side. But really on the Wellfleet-Truro line on the ocean side is really where these most of these people settled. So, of course, there were people living here long before the Europeans, and the native people, Wampanoag-speaking people, lived here for at least 3,000, maybe 10,000 years, and their buildings were called witus, which are coming back in. There's quite a few under construction right now. And actually, witus were still used until the 1960s, apparently, by some Wampanoag families. They would build them out behind their main house and use them in the summer. And if you've ever been to Mashpee, the Wampanoag tribal area, there's a number of them, as well as a big council house where they make all their decisions. So the witu introduces a number of things which become themes on the Outer Cape architecture. They use what's readily available material. They are a light frame with a sort of skin hung on it. And then they are flexible. Often, actually, the bark would be removed and moved back. So the Wampanoags lived on the shore in the summer for fishing and shellfishing and eel trapping, and then they would move back into the woods in the winter, and they would often leave the frame there and take the skin. This is another theme of Cape Cod architecture, which is taking parts and reusing them, moving them, expanding them. Apparently, when the settlers got here, they said that these were very comfortable buildings with the central fire pit, and that they were cozier than the settlers' houses. Also, soon after the Europeans arrived, all the trees were cut down for firewood, shipbuilding, house building, and then wood became extremely valuable. So there was a whole economy based on shipwrecks, and there was all this maritime law. I'm sure a lot of you know this, that when a ship ran aground, it belonged to the town, the people of that town, and the town would go out and disassemble the building. And Thoreau, in Thoreau's Cape Cod, he talks about watching a man take a mast of a ship and make it into hundreds of shingles with a hatchet. So they were always reusing and repurposing, especially wood. Another theme is taking vernacular utilitarian buildings and repurposing them as for cultural purposes. So this is a fish pier in Provincetown, and it was the first theater for the Provincetown Players and Eugene O'Neill. So Eugene O'Neill's first play was performed in this fish pier, with the audience sitting on planks and barrels, and the water actually coming up and splashing the participants. This later burned and is no longer there. Also, moving buildings. So this is a house that was at Long Point in Provincetown, which was floated across to Commercial Street. Buildings were floated or flaked and taken apart and moved on sleds in the winter. And in Wellfleet, at least, almost every house, at least part of it, used to be somewhere else. Also, in the mid-20th century, there was still a lot of oyster shacks in Wellfleet. And these were shacks on piers, so the boats would go up and unload there. And this is interesting as far as the modernist prototypes that come later of these sort of rectangular boxes that are up on piers. So the modernists were very interested in vernacular New England architecture, which they really admired because of its functionality and its unpretentiousness. They didn't like Victorian architecture or anything that seemed to be pretending to be something that it wasn't. So Wellfleet in the 30s was very depopulated. It got down to 300 people, and according to one of the census during the Depression. So there was a lot of empty land and a lot of empty buildings, and it was very, very cheap. You could buy land for $20 to $25 an acre in Wellfleet during the Depression. And this one man, Dr. Rollins, who was a dentist and an inventor, acquired 800 acres as a bird sanctuary So this is the end of Black Pond Road in Wellfleet. This is Horseleech Pond, and on the right is the Atlantic. So you can see very few trees. In fact, large areas of Wellfleet and Truro there were no trees at all. His nephew, Jack Phillips, when he got out of Harvard undergrad, his uncle gave him this 800 acres, and he started living there, kind of homesteading and building sort of his version of modern architecture. He'd been to Europe, he'd seen early modern buildings, and he was basically imitating those on a very low-tech materials. You might have seen in the New York Times on Sunday, there was an article about the trust and all the books that have been coming out lately by the children and grandchildren of this generation. So Jack Phillips's daughter, Hayden Herrera, wrote this book, Upper Bohemia, came out recently. Her niece wrote The Paper Palace, and these all take place around Horseleech Pond and among this sort of bohemian subculture. John Taylor Williams just wrote The Shores of Bohemia, which is about political radicals, artists and writers, 1910 to 1960 on the Outer Cape. And then Mary McCarthy and Edmund Wilson's son, Rule, wrote this book, To the Life of the Silver Harbor, which is a reminiscence of their life in Wellfleet. So by the 40s, a lot of writers and artists were moving to Wellfleet and buying these old houses very inexpensively. And of course, there was a railroad. You could get on the train in New York and get off in Wellfleet and walk to your house. So they didn't have cars. And if they would have, Edmund Wilson and Mary McCarthy always had these drunken arguments, and one of them would walk to the train station and go back to New York. So, and this is in a time when there was no highway. It took a very long time to get down to the Outer Cape driving a car, so this was very important. I know my aunt and uncle were Provincetown painters, and they never had a car. They just got on went to Grand Central Station, got on the train, and got off at Provincetown. So this is one of Jack Phillips's early buildings. It's a studio that's right on the dune. He made this with salvaged material, literally sometimes with driftwood, old window sashes. So this is a north-facing painting studio. And he made a lot of these very kind of ad hoc structures that were based loosely on European modern buildings that he'd seen. These guys were, Jack Phillips and his friends were sort of self-taught carpenters. And in this New York Times article, his daughter mentions that his favorite building material was duct tape. And he was actually buried with a roll of duct tape. So they were artists, and they were kind of, in splendid isolation, were really, nobody was watching. They were just sort of putting up buildings when they wanted to, and this building later fell into the ocean due to erosion. It's a painting of the studio by the painter Javier Gonzalez, Spanish painter that had a painting school in Wellfleet. Jack Phillips also bought a trainload of old army barracks just after the war. These were prefab, flat pack barracks. This is two of them put together. And he would just started putting these up wherever he thought was a good spot for a house on this 800 acres. They're all still there except for one. And this is the house of Arthur Schlesinger, the historian his family still lives there. So there's often a kind of an inverse, reverse snobism that the more important you are, the smaller your house is. And there's a very Thoreauvian concept of living in a little cabin in nature. So this is actually a beautiful spot right on Slough Pond. And it looks basically exactly like that today. This is the postmodern architect, Charles Jenks. Actually, it's a memorial for him today happening in Wellfleet this evening, but he grew up partly in Wellfleet, and this is him in front of the Schlesinger's barracks. So, as I say, there were a lot of empty buildings, and very few trees. So this is Boundbrook Island in Wellfleet, and this is a house that was owned by John Dos Passos and Katie Dos Passos, which they never actually moved into. And then in the late 30s, they sold it to Jack Hall. This is a house from 1720. Jack Hall was another one of these sort of, we call them the Brahmin Bohemians. They were from families in Boston and Philadelphia and had gone to good schools, although they kind of dropped out and wanted to sort of homestead in Wellfleet, and they were farming, they were painting, they were building structures. So he found a few old barns in Truro, post and beam barns, and he put them up, and he created this sort of little homestead farm on Boundbrook Island. This is his Rolls Royce that he used to drive into Provincetown with people standing on the sideboards. So Jack Hall, he really liked old buildings, but he really liked modernism, so he would often just sort of mash them together. So this was one of his houses, which is another house, a different farmhouse from the early 1700s. And he would sort of blast out large areas of wall and put big plate glass windows. And this is a sort of a funny vernacular mashup that's peculiar to Wellfleet, I think, which is this combination of old buildings and modernism in this sort of pastiche. So Jack Hall's crowning achievement, I think, is the Hatch House, built in 1961-62 for Robert Hatch, who is the editor of The Nation, and his wife Ruth, who is a painter. So I make a connection here with the Witu because there's this idea of a very light frame with this skin hung on it, and that the building is sort of mutable and and changeable. And you can see here that the frame, this is actually during construction, but there's a sort of superstructure here. So Jack Hall never went to architecture school, as most of these people, true of most of these people, but he did work for the great designer George Nelson in New York for a few years before he built the Hatch House. And he worked on this USAID project in Moscow that they built in this big park in Moscow, and part of it was this thing called the Jungle Gym, which was a huge scaffolding structure for showing US products. This is where Khrushchev had the speech where he was, the kitchen argument where he's fighting, was it with Nixon? Nixon, yeah, where they're arguing about whose kitchens are better, Russian or American kitchens. So you can see, if you just look at the lower left-hand corner, that really is kind of the Hatch House, you know, in a slightly different scale and with different materials, but this idea of this superstructure with these panels inserted. Also, he would have seen this project by George Nelson, which is a prefab aluminum factory-made house that is these cubes connected by walkways. And these were up on stilts that were like car jacks that you could raise and lower. And this was never built, but he would have been familiar with this. So the Hatch house was completed in '62, and you can see it's a very thin membrane. So not only is there no insulation, there's really no wall cavity, and there's no studs. So that's the back of the siding that you're seeing. It really is like a like a shack. It's like a very high concept dune shack. And since there's no plywood, the sheer strength of the building really comes from that superstructure. So this is the first house that this is actually the second house that we got from the National Park Service. So I started the trust in 2006 in order to try to apply for leases for these buildings. So all of the buildings, so the legislation to create the national park was introduced in '59 by the Kennedys and Saltonstalls, and everybody fought about it for 2 years. It passed in '61. And if you started building in those 2 years, you were gambling, basically. And when it passed, the legislation passed in '61, those people were bought out at market value, and then they had to surrender the house after 25 years usually. And the park's plan was to demolish all these buildings and let this go back to nature. So these houses were actually all supposed to be gone. The park is very, very slow moving, and and also very underfunded, and it just wasn't on their priority to demolish some of these, and so they thank God they survived. But when we got this, so when Ruth Hatch, we were already talking to Ruth Hatch, who was 93 when I met her, and they knew they were going to lose the house when Ruth died. She had a special year-to-year lease. So they kind of stopped taking care of the house, and it was in very bad shape when we got it. This is the foundation crew. We had to redig all the footings and re-pour them and do a lot of infrastructure work to make the building stable. And you can see there's these outdoor walkways, so you have to go outside to get from room to room. This is the view of the harbor, of the bay, and Provincetown off in the distance to the north. So we, the way we finance the whole nonprofit is we rent these weekly in the summer to a lot of, architecture fans and artists and writers, and this is the most primitive building, and it's the most popular building, so people love this. There's no internet, there's no washing machine, there's really nothing. In fact, when it was built, there was a water pump by the kitchen sink, and there was no electricity. There was just kerosene lamps. There is electricity, but it's a very, very primitive building, but it's very magical. And the whole thing opens and closes, so these shutters close up in the winter. The whole thing closes, and really the first time I saw it, I thought it was a shed for storing lobster pots or something. There was really no clue that it was a house. It was such an abstract object. This is the interior, and this is the only house where we got the contents. So because we were talking to the Hatch family, they had put everything in storage, and so we got the books and the furniture and the art and all the kitchen equipment and everything. So that's really helps to give context to the building, and it's very immersive when you go in there. It's really just like it was in 1962. This was a big sort of lefty salon, so Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn were very close friends, and I actually had dinner with Howard Zinn shortly before he died here. I think Noam is in Arizona now, but anyway, this is great to have all the things. It's really interesting too, the books that people had. Like he has the little versions of all of Shakespeare's plays, because before the internet, you really, if you wanted reference material, you had to have it all hard copy. This is a plan, so you can see it's these little 7 by 7 foot cubes, and actually the family added one cube there on the right. So they followed all the same rules of creating one more module to make that room bigger. But this really is truly a modular He designed it as a prefab building, and he had designs to arrange the cubes in all different ways to make like a square donut or an L shape. And this is the only one that was ever built, but he tried to get other people to build them. It's a rendering that we did for the book showing the shutters. So the third one of those Brahmin Bohemians was Hayden Walling. He came as an 18-year-old. His parents were famous radicals who were friends of John Reed and Mary Heaton Vorst in Provincetown. His parents actually were two of the founders of the NAACP and the International Ladies Garment Union. He came here at 18 and bought a piece of land from Jack Phillips, probably for a couple of $100. And he started building his own house using pieces of old buildings. So this is a tower that was a water tower that was downtown that they were getting rid of, and he dragged it down there with a wagon. And actually, a lot of the bricks were from the old settlement, because one of the old towns in Wellfleet was back in the woods here, and there were still these old locust beams and bricks. So a lot of these buildings, as I say, are this sort of mashup of vernacular and modern, and this is an interior of that. Hayden Walling also never studied architecture or carpentry, but he became a very good carpenter and actually built houses for other designers as well. This is the Lachey House, 1961, for the painter James Lachey. A lot of old wood that he would reuse, old barnwood. And he also didn't do drawings, so he would have a little napkin sketch, and he would get there, and often the wood he had would dictate sort of the shape of rooms and how big the spans were and so forth. This is a studio for the Lachey House. So there are a lot of these studios with north-facing glass. And this is the house that's actually on the cover of my book. And, you know, they had to work with basic lumberyard material, and they couldn't get big sheets of plate glass. So often he would just frame a wall like a regular stud wall, and then use strips of single pane glass and create this kind of big wall of glass look, with using just what was readily available. A lot of these houses used to have panoramic views of the ocean, but the forest, the forest has grown up. This is all national park. So imagine looking out that at the Atlantic. So at the same time in Germany, starting in 1919, a bit earlier, is the Bauhaus school. The first one was in Dessau, and then, in Weimar, then Dessau, and then the last one was in Berlin. And it was this two schools put together, a school of art and a school of craft, and it was founded by Walter Gropius. So the idea behind the Bauhaus was really to take the continuum of German handcraft and combine it with mass production and the materials of the Industrial Revolution. So to sort of reconcile those two things. They were kicked out of Weimar by conservative government, meant to Dessau. They were kicked out of Dessau, and the last version, it was Berlin, where they were kicked out by the Nazis. So the youngest person there, student, was Marcel Breuer. He came from provincial Hungary, and he was a master of the furniture shop. And he really pioneered tubular steel furniture inspired by bicycle handlebars, where the milkman would come every day and with this, and he became fascinated with the bicycle. So this is a very, we see this everywhere now, but in 1920, this was kind of a very radical chair. And Breuer was very interested in dematerialization and kind of hovering, gravity-defying things, or sort of the tension between gravity and weightlessness. This chair is called the Vasily chair. He designed it for Kandinsky, his friend who was a teacher at the Bauhaus. And then the Cheska chair, which is kind of his most famous chair. You'll see this chair at a gas station in Bangladesh. You know, this chair is everywhere. I think it's probably the most reproduced chair in history. And it's sort of a very poetic kind of version of his philosophy, which is that the industrial part is the structure, which is doing the structural work, and then the part that you touch should be natural and it should be handmade. So this is leather. This is like hand-worked leather, which is the part that you touch, and then the thing that makes this possible is this tubular steel, which is an industrial process. So this is sort of like a distillation of the Bauhaus idea. So Gropius on the right there, with Herbert Bayer on the left and Zanti Shvinsky, they were very close, along with Breuer and Moholy-Nagy. They were this kind of group at the Bauhaus who spent a lot of time together and did a lot of important projects together. The early scholars, or scholars in the 70s and 80s, were always saying that women at the Bauhaus were forced to just do weaving and they weren't allowed to do anything else. It's actually recent scholarship has revealed that actually women were all through the Bauhaus doing all kinds of stuff. Here's a woman in the wood shop, in the furniture area, and especially a lot of really amazing photography that has really just come to light very recently. So this is Mariana Brandt, who did a lot of experimental photography, a lot of them self-portraits. A lot of this work was lost because of the war, and a lot of these people all scattered and, you know, to escape the rise of the fascism, and a lot of this work was lost. So this has really, a lot of this has really just come to light recently. This is Mariana Brandt, who also did this photography, self-portrait photography in costumes, which is very much like Cindy Sherman or something, although Cindy Sherman never would have seen this work because it wasn't known. But really interesting. Of course, when you Google Bauhaus, you get the 80s goth band. And I think they really picked up, being art students, they really picked up on the early Bauhaus, which was very gothic and expressionist. And then the Bauhaus made this kind of, so it was started in 1919, ended in 1933, and by the end they had really embraced more of the technology. They had moved away from expressionism more toward rationalism, and the band that represents that period is Kraftwerk, of course. So every year we have a artist-scholar residency, and this year it is for Bauhaus scholars, and the woman on the upper left, Elizabeth Otto, is the curator this year, and she actually has done a lot of this primary research that has found a lot of this work. She's written 4 books on the Bauhaus, so really looking forward to that. They're coming in November, and they stay in our houses and spend a couple of weeks, and they're actually going to be looking at a lot of the material that we have collected from Marcel Breuer's house, which hasn't ever been archived. So they're going to be looking at the Bauhaus material that we have. So the Nazis closed the last version of the Bauhaus in 1933. By then, Gropius and Breuer and everybody had fled. First they went to London, and then in 1937, Gropius was hired to take over Harvard's architecture school and created the Graduate School of Design. So the summer of 37, they spent in Marion, right on Buzzards Bay, and this whole group spent that summer here on the Cape. That's Moholy-Nagy in the center, Herbert Bayer and Zante Stravinsky. And here they are reenacting Neptune and his sons wrestling a sea serpent. They always had a good time. So after that summer, Breuer and Gropius went to Harvard. Moholy-Nagy went to Chicago and started the new Bauhaus. Some of them were teaching at Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and Herbert Bayer went to MoMA and did the first big Bauhaus show, retrospective show. So around that, by the early 40s, some of these people were sort of filtering back to the Cape. And the first European that got here was Serge Chermayeff, who's Russian by way of England, and came to Wellfleet and bought a piece of land from Jack Phillips, a little hunting cabin, and started a kind of homestead. This is his wife Barbara, who's British, and Ivan Chermayeff, who designed many of the famous logos of the 60s, ABC and PBS and all of the famous logos from that period. And then Peter Chermayeff, who designed the New England Aquarium and a lot of other aquariums. So Chermayeff starts building these sort of experimental studios. And it always looked to me like sort of a house of cards. Again, a very light frame with this sort of panelized structures hanging on them, a skin hanging on them. These buildings could be expanded, and this one has been. So they were in 8-foot modules, and they would just keep adding modules as they needed more space. And also these panels could be taken out and moved around. So again, continuing that theme. There are 7 of these in Wellfleet, and they're all still there. So Chermayeff there in the center, Jerry Kepish on the right, and Bernard Radovsky on the left. They were, this is 1945. So by 1945, they were all kind of coalescing in the woods there, working on various projects. Chermayeff was teaching at Yale. Kepish started the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, which has kind of become the Media Lab and the Art, Culture, Technology. And Bernard Radovsky did a lot of important shows at MoMA, including Architecture Without Architects, and he became a very important theoretician. This is Gropius in 1945, so in Wellfleet, and Zante Stravinsky. They were making kites, apparently. So the gang is all here by the mid-40s. Breuer designed this, came up with this house design he called the Longhouse, and this became one of his 2 main house prototypes, which is a long wooden box on piers with a suspended porch, suspended by cables. This didn't work out, and he ended up, I'll show you, the porch ended up being a kind of a wood structure with a roof and screened in with this sort of truss, partial tension compression truss. This is a plan, so the part on the left is the original prototype, and then he would often add a studio and then an extension to the studio. So there are 4 versions of this house in Wellfleet, this prototype. So Breuer didn't really, he was very into prototypes, and so he didn't really feel the need to completely start over. When he got a new house commission, he'd say, well, I can do this house, but I'll flip it this way, and I'll turn it around and, modify it. This is one of those 4. This is the Wise House. You can see because of the piers, the landscape is really undisturbed. They're really just sort of perched on there. And Breuer referred to this as being like a camera on a tripod. So he wanted to get up to the height where you would get the best view, and then the hanging porch would always be in the best spot. and the landscape just continues underneath. This is a Life magazine story that never actually appeared in Life magazine, where in 1950, they came and photographed Breuer and his family and friends eating on their porch. And they could see 3 ponds from that location. This is Breuer's living room. You can see the coffee tables made of cinder blocks, and these very simple couches that he made out of lumberyard material. So Breuer was very interested in, brutalism, using the most basic materials possible. And also, when this house was built, it was a very stripped down. It was a plywood floor with just mats on it, and the studs were showing. And then over the years, he added a wood floor, and then he added a plywood ceiling. And so basically, when you got one of these houses, you got a sort of the chassis, and then you could add layers. This house is somewhat in peril right now. The son is wanting to sell it, and it's been very neglected. So it's not owned by the Park Service. It's still owned by the family, and it's very, very intact. It hasn't been maintained, but it also has not been altered. So, and it also has Breuer's books and art in it, which the son has let me take out and have conserved and put elsewhere because it was in danger and getting moldy and stuff. But anyway, this house could really be like a museum, and we're all hoping it has a happy ending. We're trying to figure out a way to acquire it, but the price is ridiculously high, which is protecting it in a way. But anyway, it's endangered. It's an unheated, uninsulated building that hasn't been maintained, and unless you really see its importance, it would really just be a tear down. This is the porch. That's Zante Shavinsky later in life, and Connie Breuer on the right, sitting on the porch. And then this woman on the left, in the first version of the book, I couldn't identify her. And then Tom Breuer said, "Oh yeah, that's Christina Bevington." And we found her. She's living in Soho in a loft, and we went to visit her. So she was working in Breuer's office in the 60s. She's French Senegalese, and I think one of the only women of color that was a architect at that period. This is Kepish and his wife Juliet in their house in Cambridge. She was an amazing illustrator. And we did a whole show at the Wellfleet Historic Society on all the children's books that this group produced, which was over 200 children's books. So Gropius's daughter, Ati, did about 50. Juliet Kepish won the Caldecott Award, and she was an amazing illustrator. So for some reason, this was really a golden age of children's books, and a lot of these people produced them. So Barry Bergdahl, the curator at MoMA for architecture, came to the show we did in 2006, and he said, there's a Breuer house in Dennis, so can you find it? And for years I looked for it, and I asked everyone I could find. Nobody had any idea there was a Breuer house there, or who Breuer was. And then the Life magazine dumped their photo archive online, and somebody sent me this and said, what's this one? And I could tell by the plan, there was a sort of two parallel lines. This was the Scott house in Dennis. And so I knew it was there. And then this reporter from the Cape Cod Times got interested, and she did a search of deeds, and we got an address, and it's there completely mint with the original furniture. This was a high-budget Breuer house with radiant heating and all this paneling and on George Nelson furniture. And so this was a real, this was a mind blower. That the family is now starting to take better care of that. A lot of these houses really, you know, when the people that build them kind of get older, and if there isn't someone in the younger generation that takes up the maintenance of them, they really kind of start to crumble in this climate. This is a very rough climate for wooden buildings. But one of their children is now really taking this on. The Geller House in Long Island was just demolished by an important Breuer house by the people next door who built a tennis court there. So, you know, in the UK, all of these buildings would be listed and there'd be all these protections. In this country, unless you, you know, we're not very good at protecting important buildings in this country. Also, part of this, how am I doing for time? Okay. Also, coming to Wellfleet in the early 50s was Paul Weidlinger. He was a very important structural engineer. He worked a lot with Breuer and Saarinen, also Hungarian. He did the Beinecke Library in Yale, which is an incredible building. If you ever go to New Haven, check it out. It's made with these sort of alabaster sheets that the light comes through. So he came to Wellfleet in '53 and bought some land across the pond from Breuer and built this house. This is one of the ones that was taken by the National Seashore and was in very advanced state of decay. This is the third house that we restored, and this one was kind of on the edge of being savable. There's a plan, and this is it finished. It was, this is what it looked like originally, and this is the interior. So with these houses, we have to furnish them based on old photographs, and you know, we take some liberties, but this bright blue color is original, and we match that exactly. There's a large Kepish painting on the right there. They were friends. And the really challenging thing in this house was this door, sliding door that was 8 foot by 16 feet. And it originally was a single pane, homemade kind of ad hoc door, which was broken. And this Austrian company donated this triple glazed lift slide Austrian super duper door, but we had to figure out how to get it down this terrible dirt roads and down this terrible driveway and up onto this house without killing anybody. Also, the whole Saarinen family started coming in the late 40s, and along with them came Florence Knoll, who grew up with the Saarinens at Cranbrook. And Florence Knoll really kind of invented modern office architecture and furniture. And she's also responsible for the mass production of all of the great architect-designed furniture of that era. Also a frequent visitor was Conrad Wachsmann, who kind of invented the space frame. This is one of his amazing drawings. Alvar Aalto visited in the 40s when he was teaching at MIT, and he did this drawing called Cape Cod Hurricane. Charlie Zender, who was an ex-Marine who came in the late 50s and actually built 53 houses that I've found so far on the Outer Cape. Some of them poured concrete. He was obsessed with the fortifications on the in the Channel Islands. It's one of his drawings. This is a house that I grew up in, which he designed. So when I was 10, my parents hired Charlie Zender to do a house for my family, and I was very fascinated by it. And we actually slept in this house while it was under construction, which is very formative. This is the first house that we restored, which is by Charlie Zender. He had met Frank Lloyd Wright when he was at UVA undergrad, and he got the bug. So he has a lot of very Frank Lloyd Wright ideas here of these huge eaves and these big cantilevers and these kind of dematerialized corners where the glass meets glass. And this is the other side of the building. There's the plan. Very eccentric. Also never studied architecture. He studied civil engineering and sculpture. In this whole story, almost none of these people went to architecture school, including Breuer, who went all the way through the Bauhaus before they had an architecture curriculum. This is during the Reconstruction. And this is the original show that we did in Provincetown in 2006, which started off this whole process. So I co-curated this show, and it started this whole research process where I started trying to find all the children and grandchildren of the architects that were still here and try to find drawings and searching archives. And a lot of this stuff was never documented, never published, and Fleet's town hall burned down in the early 60s, so there were no records. So you would find a house and it would be completely opaque about when it was built or who designed it or anything like that. We do a lot of tours of modern houses and conferences and seminars. This is one we do in the one we did in the Tremaeff House, and then we do this artist scholar residency. Last year we did a residency with all native artists from 4 tribes and from 4 states, and this was curated by Paula Peters. Here, she's staying here in front of the Tremaeff House with her corgi. These are some of the artists from last year. And this is this piece, one of the artists was this young photographer from Long Island who's the Shinnecock artist. And he took this picture of me there. I'm like being a bird watcher. And then he, using a drone, he has photoshopped himself in here in this kind of Hollywood indigenous costume. And he's an amazing artist, very young guy, and he uses this kind of zombie movie iconography to talk about the enduring indigenous presence and our anxiety about it. So all of this research has really been condensed into the book, which I have copies of if you'd like, if you're interested. And then just the last house we did is the Kohlberg House, which was also empty for 20 years and in terrible condition. And actually, the more we got into this house, the more rot we discovered. But this house is now finished, so we have 4 of the houses that we've restored. We do rent them in the summer, which is how we pay all our bills. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. A couple frames for the Kohlberg House. I have a question about those chairs. Right there, stop. Okay, so where I'm living in East End, they say they have those chairs. Do you know who made them?
Which ones?
The ones, the pair of chairs. with backs.
The beige ones?
Sorry?
The beige ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are Charles and Ray Eames. Molded fiberglass, yeah. Yes?
If you please, I'm interested in your point of view on why they didn't sold us to some of the very innovative architectural work that Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer developed. Why it hasn't had more evident impact through time into our own day? For example, were there some deficiencies in the architectural design that might not have been so attractive? I'm thinking of the master houses in Dessau, for example, which seem to be very hard to heat and not particularly well insulated. Were there some problems with the Bauhaus innovations that didn't carry over well to our own time?
That's a very big topic. I mean, I think you could say, if you look at, if you look at house construction, people do tend to go toward traditional, traditional shapes. I think there's a kind of a, fetish about capes, that that people are so fixated on capes, with the pitch roof and actually it's based on, a medieval English cottage, thatched cottage, but here is made of cedar shingles. And even with public buildings, people just make a giant one. There's the park headquarters. It's just like a giant Cape Cod cottage. It's like people have this anxiety about getting away from that because it's like the only, And then you see them all over the country. There's this, and they have a lot of deficiencies too. They're kind of dark, and they dump the water on your, down your neck when you come in the front door, and especially the old ones, they tend to mold and rot. But the modernism was really a response to the Industrial Revolution and the new materials that were available. So big areas of glass, reinforced concrete, steel, and in public buildings, modernism really has taken over. I mean, it's you don't see people making big public buildings and neo-colonial style anymore. So it's a big subject.
Well, I just follow on to ask, is there any house in Wellesley still existing that Oliver Gropius and his wife occupied?
Did he occupy? That he occupied? Actually, Gropius never built a house in Wellfleet. He rented a house because his wife Isa didn't really like the ocean, and so they rented a house on Long Pond, and it's been demolished. And he used to stay in the Holiday House, which is a hotel.
I'm curious about how you choose the houses that you renovate.
Well, the 4 houses we've renovated are all owned. They belong to the National Park Service, so we have long-term leases on them, and so basically they were the 4 houses that were available.
Are you continuing to do that?
There are only 7 houses, modern houses of interest, and one of them has fallen down, is not savable, and 2 are being used by the Park Service.
The other thing I was curious about, you said you did something about tours. Do you do tours around?
Yes, we do tours, although they've gotten smaller because of COVID, but we do them in there.
How do you find out?
Just go to our website, Cape Cod Modern House Trust. Yeah.
Current building codes impact experimental or modern architectural design now? Does it constrain it, or if I were a brand new architect today, what would my thought be about the issues with building codes that exist?
Yeah, a lot of these houses couldn't be built today. And it's a real challenge to replicate that lightness. I think what I really love about these buildings is they're very light. They're like butterflies. And I mean, the Hatch House has survived since 1961 through many hurricanes. So it's actually strangely resilient. I think because it doesn't provide much resistance, like the wind just goes around it and through it. But with the hurricane, with the wind codes that we are now under, they have to put so much tie downs, and that you have to kind of really overbuild everything. So it's a real challenge to, especially to get that lightness. I mean, you can get triple pane glass. You can do huge sliders, that meet code. They're very expensive, but the other thing about these houses is they were very, very cheap, and really a lot of them kind of homemade, so those days are gone. I mean, you can do that up in Maine, when no one. You didn't even really need a building permit in Wellfleet until the early 70s. So. Mm-hmm. Yes, all 3 of our houses are on the National Register, and the 4th one is eligible. And the Park Service considers that safe. So, actually, we did a whole study. We cooperated with the park on a context study, which actually Jenny Adams, who's here, who's on our board, was very involved in, of the modern houses on the Outer Cape. So there was a National Registry context study, and then that paves the way for individual buildings being put on the National Register.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so like you talked about how a lot of the mimic SW2 structure, but you talked about how those structures could be adapted into winter months. Were any of these houses like adaptable to actually be lived in the winter, or was it mainly just either shut down?
Some of them were made to be 3-season or year-round, and then some of them were converted. Although some of them there's really no way to do that. Like the Hatch House is really only occupiable till mid-October, and there's really no way to hide any insulation, with some of them, with the Cool Gibbs house, that Frank Lloyd Wright house, we took down all the ceilings, and we insulated we insulated everything we could insulate. And that is pretty comfortable year-round. And the Kohlberg house, which is this one, is extremely comfortable all winter because we hit a lot of insulation, and then we put in heat pumps, and that is and with the new doors and windows, it's very comfortable. So some of them you can retrofit, and some you can't.
I'd like to invite you all to speak to the author one-on-one, to come and explore his books and look at his T-shirts, and have some dessert with us. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.